I never imagined that spending time with our horse while my husband was away could turn into the most exhilarating day of my life. It all began a few weeks ago when my husband left for a business trip, leaving me and our horse, Storm, alone at the ranch. The silence when he was gone was always heavy, more than just the absence of sound. I had grown used to it over the years. His trips were frequent, sometimes lasting weeks. I didn't resent his work. It paid for our comfortable ranch life, the sprawling fields, and the stables that often felt too big for just the two of us. Or, as it often seemed, just for me and Storm. Storm, our majestic black stallion, had been my constant companion for 5 years. We brought him home as a spirited young colt, and over time he became my anchor. While my husband worked long hours or traveled to distant cities, Storm was always there, greeting me with a gentle nuzzle and those deep, knowing eyes that seemed to understand far more than a horse should. Tonight was one of those nights where the emptiness of the ranch pressed down on me. I tried filling the silence with music, the TV, even an audiobook, but nothing helped. After dinner, a lonely affair of reheated leftovers, I wandered out to the stables with a cup of tea. Storm stood in his stall, his ears perking up as I approached. He always stayed close, as if sensing that I needed him more on nights like these. I reached out, letting my hand rest on his sleek, dark coat. "You're all I've got tonight," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Storm responded with a soft "naker," his breath warm against my hand. Our bond had always been special. He wasn't just a horse. He was my confidant, the one who filled the gaps left by my husband's absence. Over time, I began to realize how much I relied on Storm. His quiet companionship brought me a comfort I couldn't find elsewhere. It wasn't just his loyalty or his gentle nature, it was the way he seemed to truly see me, to understand the parts of myself I didn't know how to share. The evening stretched on, the minutes ticking by with an almost maddening slowness. I scrolled aimlessly through my phone, glancing at pictures of friends and their families, their lives full of noise and chaos. It made the silence of my own life feel even more profound. Storm shifted beside me, his head resting against my shoulder now, and I couldn't help but smile. At least I wasn't entirely alone. "You're such a good boy," I said softly. He responded with a soft snort, his tail swishing lazily. Moments like this made me grateful for him, for the uncomplicated love he offered so freely. It wasn't the same as having my husband here, but it was enough to make the loneliness bearable. Eventually, the tea began to work its magic, the edges of my thoughts softening as I leaned against the stable wall. Storm shifted again, pressing closer to me in a way that made it feel like he was trying to shield me from the emptiness of the ranch. I reached out, brushing my hand along his neck, and found myself talking to him without really thinking about it. "You know, Storm, sometimes I wonder if he even notices how much time he spends away," I said. "I mean, I get it. He's busy. He's doing what he has to do, but sometimes—" Storm's ears twitched, and he turned his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a kind of understanding that made my chest ache. It was ridiculous, I knew, to project my feelings onto him, but in that moment it felt like he understood me in a way no one else did. "You get it?" I continued, my hand still stroking his mane. "If you're here." The stable grew quieter, the only sounds the faint rustle of hay and the soft rhythm of Storm's breathing. I let my hand rest on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. It was calming, grounding in a way I desperately needed. The silence no longer felt so oppressive with Storm beside me. It was almost comforting. As the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on the life my husband and I had built. It wasn't bad, not by any stretch. We had a beautiful ranch, financial stability, and a routine that worked for the most part. But somewhere along the way it had begun to feel hollow, like something was missing. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but the distance between us had grown a quiet chasm neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. Storm nudged my hand with his nose, pulling me out of my thoughts. I smiled, grateful for the distraction. Thanks, buddy, I said. You always know when I need you. He responded with a soft whinny, his eyes shining with a warmth that made my heart ache. It was moments like these that reminded me how much he meant to me, how much he had become a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. He wasn't just a horse, he was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. I stayed in the stable with Storm for hours, the weight of the evening slowly lifting as his presence filled the empty spaces. By the time I finally headed back to the house, I felt lighter, more at peace. Storm followed me to the gate, as he always did, watching as I made my way inside. As I turned off the lights and lay down, I found myself whispering into the darkness, "Good night, Storm. Thank you for being here." And as I said those words, something struck me. The look in his eyes excited me. Maybe it was the tea, maybe it was the loneliness, the longing to feel some excitement when you're alone with your horse. I didn't know yet, but later on I would definitely find out. And it made me do things I would have never imagined. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of Storm's hooves pawing at the ground outside. He always seemed to know when I needed an extra push to start the day. His dark eyes peered over the fence, and I couldn't help but smile as he let out a low, cheerful whinny, almost like he was saying, "Good morning, let's get moving." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, pulling on my boots as I headed outside. All right, I'm up." Storm trotted to the gate, pausing to look back at me as if urging me to follow. It was our routine now, his quiet insistence that life goes on, even when the ranch felt too big and too quiet without my husband around. After breakfast, I saddled up Storm, his tail swishing with anticipation. I grabbed his reins, and his excitement grew, his whole body vibrating with energy. A ride was exactly what I needed to clear my mind and shake off the remnants of last night's reflections. The fields were still waking up, the air crisp and fresh, the only sounds the occasional chirp of birds and the distant rustle of leaves. Storm stayed close to my side as we rode, his steps steady and sure. It was one of the things I loved most about him, his calm, steady presence, even when the world felt chaotic. As we reached the edge of the property, I decided to let him run. He bounded ahead, his mane flowing in the wind, the sheer joy of it bringing a smile to my face. Watching him like that, so free and full of life, always made me feel a little lighter. I dismounted and sat on a nearby rock, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me as I kept an eye on Storm. He was galloping through the fields now, his hooves kicking up dust as he raced across the open land. "You're ridiculous," I called out to him, laughing as he turned back toward me, his tail swishing furiously. He trotted over, his breath coming in soft puffs as he nuzzled against my hand. For a while, we just sat there, the two of us, soaking in the quiet of the morning. I found myself talking to Storm again, as I often did when it was just the two of us. There was something comforting about it, like he was a sounding board for the thoughts I couldn't quite say out loud to anyone else. "I don't know, Storm," I began. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different, if we weren't stuck in this routine?" He looked at me with those big, expressive eyes, and I could almost imagine him saying, "I'm listening." It was silly, of course, to think that he understood the complexities of my thoughts, but in moments like this it felt like he did. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for what we have, but sometimes it feels like something's missing. I sighed, leaning back against the rock. "Your dad, he's a good man, but he's always gone, and when he's here, Storm let out a soft whinny, resting his head on my shoulder, and I felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry," I said. But Storm didn't seem to mind. He stayed right there, his head on my shoulder, his tail swishing in slow, steady movements. It was moments like these that reminded me how much I relied on him not just as a horse, but as a companion, a friend who was always there when I needed him. As the morning wore on, we made our way back to the stables. I spent the rest of the day tackling chores, the kind of mundane tasks that helped pass the time. Storm followed me from the stables to the fields, his presence a constant comfort. He'd graze nearby, his eyes tracking my movements as if to say, "I'm here. Don't worry." Later that evening, after dinner, I found myself back in the stables with Storm by my side. The loneliness I usually felt during my husband's absence was still there, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been the night before. Storm had a way of filling the emptiness, of making the silence feel less oppressive. But still, I was missing something. And each time I looked at Storm, he told me he could fill that void. I reached out to stroke his mane, my fingers trailing along the soft strands. "You're a lifesaver," I said, my voice soft. Storm responded with a soft snort, his tail swishing lazily. I smiled, leaning back against the stable wall and letting myself relax for the first time all day. The warmth of his body against mine was comforting, grounding in a way that nothing else seemed to be. As the evening stretched on, I found myself reflecting on the bond we shared. It wasn't just the loyalty or the companionship, though those things were certainly part of it. It was the way Storm seemed to see me, to understand me in a way that felt almost human. He was more than just a horse. He was a reminder that I wasn't alone, even in the quietest, loneliest moments. I stayed in the stables with Storm long after the sun had set, the two of us cocooned in the quiet warmth of our shared space. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself, but in that moment it felt like enough. The days blurred together. The routine of my life steady but uninspiring. My husband's return was delayed again, another trip that had stretched longer than planned. I told myself I was fine with it. After all, I'd grown accustomed to his absences. Yet, as the days passed, I found myself leaning on Storm more and more. It was late afternoon when I stood in the stables, brushing Storm's coat while he stood patiently, his ears twitching in response to the faint sounds of the ranch. The golden light streaming through the stable windows bathed the room in warmth, but I still felt cold inside. My thoughts wandered as I stared out at the fields, the weight of my own loneliness pressing against me. "A Storm," I called softly. He lifted his head, his eyes locking on mine as if he could sense the shift in my mood. Grabbing his reins, I led him out of the stables. We didn't have a destination in mind, but the act of leaving the ranch felt like a small rebellion against the monotony. Storm trotted beside me, his head held high, his mane flowing in the breeze as we made our way to the open fields. His joy was infectious, and I felt myself smiling for the first time that day. Eventually, we ended up at a secluded meadow on the edge of the property. The meadow was quiet, the kind of place where the only sounds were the rustling of grass and the distant chirp of birds. I let Storm roam free, watching as he bounded ahead, his tail swishing with enthusiasm. He'd always loved the outdoors, and seeing him so full of life eased the ache in my chest. I followed him through the meadow, the soft crunch of grass under my boots grounding me. Storm darted between the trees, pausing every so often to glance back at me, as if to make sure I was still there. His energy was contagious, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me, the tension in my shoulders easing as I inhaled the crisp, clean air. As we walked, my thoughts drifted to the life I'd built with my husband. I loved him, at least, I thought I did, but lately that love felt more like a habit than a feeling, a quiet companionship that lacked the spark it once had. And in his absence, it was Storm who had filled the void, his unwavering loyalty a balm to my restless heart. I found a quiet spot under a tree and sat down, watching as Storm grazed nearby, his tail swishing as he explored. He eventually wandered back to me, nuzzling against my hand with a satisfied sigh. I reached out, scratching behind his ears, and he leaned into my touch, his warm, steady presence grounding me once again. "You're my rock," I said, my voice soft. Storm looked at me, his expressive eyes filled with a warmth that made my chest tighten. It was moments like this that reminded me just how much he meant to me, how his presence had become a lifeline in a world that often felt too quiet. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the meadow. I stayed there with Storm, the two of us cocooned in the peace of the moment. Time seemed to slow, the world outside the meadow fading away, until it was just us. I felt a strange sense of clarity in that stillness, as if the weight of my thoughts had been lifted, leaving me free to simply exist. As we made our way back to the ranch, I realized how much I'd needed this time away from the stables, from the routine, from the thoughts that had been circling my mind. Storm trotted beside me, his steps in sync with mine, and I felt a surge of gratitude for him. He wasn't just my horse, he was my constant, my anchor, the one thing that made the loneliness bearable. The ride back was quiet, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Storm moved steadily, his breath coming in soft puffs as we made our way home. I reached out, letting my hand rest on his neck, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known I was searching for. When we arrived back at the ranch, the stables felt less empty, less oppressive. Storm followed me inside, his tail swishing as he settled into his stall. I sank onto a bale of hay, feeling a quiet sense of contentment. The bond I shared with Storm was unlike anything else in my life, pure, uncomplicated, and steady. That night, as I lay in bed with Storm's soft whinnies drifting in from the stables, I found myself reflecting on the connection we shared. It wasn't something I could easily put into words, but it was real, tangible in a way that filled the empty spaces left by my husband's absence. Storm wasn't just a horse to me, he was my partner, my confidant, and in many ways, my closest friend. And for now, that was enough. Or was it? 16:14:16:50. The following night was darker than usual, the kind of inky blackness that wrapped around the ranch and pressed against the windows. The air felt heavy, charged, as though a storm was waiting to break. Storm stood in his stall, his ears twitching as I approached. I hadn't turned on the lights, letting the faint glow of the moon guide me as I made my way to him. I leaned against the stall door, my hand resting on his neck. The quiet of the ranch was overwhelming, the absence of my husband a stark reminder of how much space he occupied, even when he wasn't here. My hand found its way to Storm's mane, stroking absent-mindedly as my thoughts swirled. "You're all I have right now," I murmured. Storm responded with a soft nicker, his breath warm against my hand. He turned his head to look at me, his deep, dark eyes filled with an understanding that made my chest ache. I let out a shaky breath, my hand stilling on his neck. "But it's just us, isn't it?" The words hung in the air, heavier than I intended, but Storm didn't seem to mind. He nuzzled closer, his warmth seeping into me as the weight of my loneliness pressed harder. The connection between us felt different that night, stronger, somehow. It wasn't just the comfort of his presence or the way he seemed to sense my every mood. It was something deeper, a bond that went beyond words or logic. I leaned against the stall door, closing my eyes as I let myself sink into the moment of the quiet, the warmth of Storm against me. Time seemed to blur as we stayed like that, the two of us cocooned in the stillness. My hand moved to his head, my fingers trailing along the soft curve of his ears. He let out a low, contented sigh, his tail swishing gently against the stall wall. The sound of his breathing, steady and rhythmic, filled the stable, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. I opened my eyes, glancing down at him. His gaze met mine, and for a moment everything else faded away: the stable, the empty ranch, the ache of my husband's absence. It all dissolved, leaving just the two of us. My hand lingered on his head, my fingers brushing through his mane as I felt an inexplicable pull, a connection so strong it left me breathless. Storm shifted, pressing closer to me, his warmth a balm to the cold emptiness that had settled in my chest. I leaned forward slightly, my forehead resting against his as I closed my eyes again, letting the moment wash over me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt, a mix of comfort and longing, of gratitude and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. "And I don't know what I'd do without you," I whispered. Storm responded with a soft nuzzle, his nose brushing against my cheek as his tail swished once more. It was as though he understood, as though he felt the same unspoken bond that had grown between us. 1946. The minutes stretched on, the world outside the stable forgotten as I stayed there with Storm, the connection between us wrapping around me like a lifeline. It wasn't just that he was here, that he was loyal and steady and always by my side. It was the way he made me feel seen, understood, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't sure how long we stayed like that, but when I finally pulled back, my heart was racing, my breath shallow. Storm's eyes were locked on mine, his expression calm but intense, as though he was waiting for something. My hand lingered on his head, my fingers trailing down to his neck as I struggled to find the words to explain what I was feeling. But there were no words for this, no way to capture the depth of what Storm meant to me, of how his presence had filled the empty spaces in my life. All I could do was stand there, my hand on his mane, my heart pounding as I tried to process the moment. Eventually, I leaned back against the stall door, my hands still resting on Storm as he settled beside me once more. The weight of the moment lingered, a quiet reminder of the bond we shared, of the way he had become so much more than just a horse to me. As the night wore on, I felt a sense of clarity settle over me, the kind that came not from logic, but from something deeper, something instinctive. Storm had always been my anchor, my constant in a world that often felt too chaotic, too lonely. And in that moment, I realized just how much I needed him, not just as a companion, but as a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone. 20:22:21. For the stable was still silent as I eventually made my way back to the house, Storm's soft whinnies following me as I walked. He stayed by the gate, watching as I disappeared inside, his presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't entirely alone. I lay there in the darkness, my thoughts still swirling, but my heart a little lighter, a little more at peace. As I drifted off to sleep, I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Storm, for everything." He was looking at me in a way that made me feel he could sense what I felt, with the loneliness, the desire for some excitement. His eyes were telling me he was the one who could give that to me when my husband was away. Something in me started to shift, asking myself if I needed to give in to those temptations. Maybe. I shook my head. No. Although something in me definitely wanted to. A part of me wanted to find out what he was up to. Maybe later on I would give in to that temptation, but not yet. I wasn't ready for it. 21:21:45. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting a golden glow across the room. I blinked awake, the heaviness of the night before still lingering in the back of my mind. Storm was already up, standing by the fence, his ears twitching as he watched me approach. "Good morning, buddy," I murmured. He leaned into my hand, his warm breath tickling my wrist. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. As I got ready for the day, Storm followed me from the stables to the fields, his presence a quiet comfort. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind, vivid and raw, as though they had etched themselves into my memory. I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us, though I wasn't sure what it meant. After breakfast, I found myself back in the stables, Storm at my side. The quiet of the ranch felt less oppressive today, more like a cocoon than a void. I let my fingers trail through Storm's mane, my mind drifting as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. For years, I had buried my feelings, pushed them down beneath the surface to keep life running smoothly. But Storm had a way of drawing them out, of making me confront the loneliness I had tried so hard to ignore. His unwavering loyalty, his quiet understanding, it had been a lifeline, one I hadn't realized I needed until it was too late. Storm was looking at me with those eyes again, and all of a sudden, I just couldn't resist it anymore. We had a bond so close, I just needed to give in. It was as if he was telling me that he could fill my void of loneliness with some excitement. I leaned in towards him, and he immediately knew. I kissed him, and there was such a tension between us that I can't quite name. His tail swished furiously, and, of course, I can't go into full details, but I can tell that I let myself go. I went on my knees and turned around. Well, when Storm was doing his thing, I could have never imagined that it could be that good. The bond we shared even strengthened what we were doing. It was so amazing. After, I think, 30 to 40 minutes, he finished, and I sighed, leaning back against the stable wall. "What are we doing?" I asked softly, my voice tinged with a mix of wonder and confusion. He looked at me, his deep eyes meeting mine, and for a moment it felt like he was waiting for an answer too. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mundane tasks and fleeting moments of clarity. I cleaned the stables, tended to the fields, and rode Storm through the ranch, all the while feeling the weight of the bond we shared pressing against me. It wasn't something I could ignore anymore, no matter how hard I tried. By the time evening rolled around, I felt restless, a nervous energy thrumming through me that I couldn't quite shake. I grabbed Storm's reins and headed out the door, needing to clear my head. The air was crisp and cool, the faint scent of hay drifting on the breeze as we made our way to the meadow. The paths were quiet, lit only by the soft glow of the moon and the occasional flicker of fireflies in the distance. Storm trotted beside me, his steps steady and confident as he matched my pace. I let him lead the way, trusting his instincts as we wandered deeper into the fields. We eventually found ourselves at a secluded spot under the stars, the grass damp with dew, and the air humming with the quiet sounds of the night. I sat down on a fallen log, Storm settling at my feet, his body warm against the coolness of the evening. The stars overhead were bright, scattered across the sky like shards of glass, and for a moment I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. Storm shifted, resting his head on my knee, and I reached down to stroke his mane, the familiar motion grounding me. "You've always been here for me," I said softly, my voice carrying on the stillness of the night. He responded with a quiet whinny, his tail swishing against the ground. It was such a small thing, but it filled my chest with a warmth that chased away the lingering shadows of doubt and loneliness. Storm wasn't just my horse, he was my partner, my anchor, my constant in a world that often felt too big and too empty. As the minutes stretched into hours, I found myself speaking aloud, the words spilling out like water from a dam. I told Storm about my fears, my doubts, the ache of the marriage that had become more routine than connection. I spoke of the nights spent alone, of the moments when his presence had been the only thing keeping me from falling apart. And through it all, Storm stayed by my side, his quiet presence a reassurance that I wasn't alone. His loyalty, His love it was unlike anything I'd ever known, and it filled the spaces in my heart that I hadn't realized were empty. The ride back was quiet, the kind of silence that felt full of meaning rather than emptiness. Storm moved steadily, his breath coming in soft puffs as we made our way home. I glanced over at